Confused about your publishing options? Join me live on March the 7th with industry veteran Mark Leslie Lefevre for a live podcast and Q&A. In this live session, we're going to delve into the benefits of the different publishing paths, traditional, hybrid, and indie, with a special focus on self-publishing. We're going to discuss creative control, how royalties work, and achieve direct engagement with readers. During this interactive session, we're not going to shy away from discussing the challenges that indie authors often face, such as marketing, distribution, and visibility. Mark is going to be sharing practical solutions and strategies to overcome these hurdles. He's going to answer your questions. Register today at suzyvidori.com/Mark Leslie. And remember to bring your questions. See you there. Welcome to Show Don't Tell Writing with me, Suzy Vidori, where I teach you the tried and true secrets to writing fiction, nonfiction that are going to wow your readers, broken down step by step. We're going to explore writing techniques. I'm going to show you a glimpse behind the scenes of successful writers' careers that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. And I'm also going to coach writers live on their pages so that you can learn and transform your own storytelling. Whether you're just starting out, you're drafting your first book, you're editing, or you're currently rewriting that book, or maybe even your 10th book, this show's going to help you unlock the writing skills that you didn't even know you needed, but you definitely do. I'm so looking forward to helping you get your amazing ideas from your mind onto your pages in an exciting way for both you and your readers so that you can achieve your wildest writing dreams. And you're going to also have some fun doing it. Let's dive in. I was lucky enough to meet up with Joanne Haines at a conference where she and I dreamed up this episode for you on one of her all-time specialties, which is the StoryGrid methodology. Joanne is a StoryGrid certified editor as well as an Author Accelerator certified book coach. She's based near Anchorage, Alaska, and despite our relative geographical distance, we've managed to stay connected, and I couldn't wait to have this conversation with her when we were together, diving deep on a super effective method of planning and evaluating a novel that sometimes feels overly complex. I've worked with many writers who swear by the StoryGrid methodology, and it was really eye opening to pick Joanne's brain on all the good things it has to offer. She breaks it down for us step by step, concept by concept. Joanne is the founder of Shelf Life Editorial and has been an editor for nearly 20 years. She knows her stuff and she loves meeting writers where they're at in their writing journeys. She can nerd out with those who already love plotting or help guide a bit of structure for those who write by the seat of their pants. I just can't tell you how excited I am to talk to Joanne about this. Joanne is a StoryGrid certified coach as well as an Author Accelerator coach. And so we kind of danced around this. I got the chance to sit down with her in person and like, we need to podcast this and share it with our listeners. And specifically diving in on sort of the StoryGrid methodology, which is really, really cool, and how you listeners can apply it to your writing, specifically with outlining yes, and also for show don't tell. Welcome, Joanne.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here, Suzy. I'm really, really excited to talk about this.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about StoryGrid and what exactly it is? Because I know it's kind of bantered around, but just for our listeners.
Yeah. StoryGrid is a method that Sean Coyne developed when he was an acquisitions editor and literary agent in his 30 plus year career in publishing on the East Coast. And then Tim Grahl has been taking it a step further and using it as a way to teach writers how to be better writers. So I think first and foremost, I want to remind people that StoryGrid is a tool. It's just another one of those tools out there that you might resonate with that you could apply to your writing. And I know Tim has been on YouTube lately, dropping nuggets of wisdom. A lot of people are coming to us having that exposure. They also did a podcast for a long, long time while Tim learned to write and wrote his first book called The Threshing. And so there's been a lot of learning over these many years, and StoryGrid's evolved even since then. And it's a really exciting tool. And there's a lot of us StoryGrid certified editors that just nerd out about it. So
I love it.
I'm
And
happy to be here to nerd.
I mean, I always think about StoryGrid as primarily an outlining tool. Is that right, or is that only part of it?
That's actually only part of it. It's actually more of an analysis tool. So the way Sean developed it was he was getting manuscripts as an acquisitions editor, and he didn't know what editors did to say this is good or not good.
It
And
was kind of a gut
it's
thing, or
kind of a gut thing, and he needed something more tangible than that. So over his career, he developed StoryGrid, where he takes manuscripts scene by scene, and he looks for what he calls the five commandments of storytelling, which are part of every unit of story, and he applies value shifts to every scene, and he has a whole spreadsheet. It can be very overwhelming to some people and very exciting to others, but it's a tool he used as an editor to help decide if a manuscript needed more work or was ready to go. So it actually, and so what it's becoming is the opposite of that, and that's where it gets kind of sticky, is because I think it was designed as one thing. We're starting to use it as another thing, but it works both ways. Is
and
that
yeah, and when would you apply this? Is it something that you can only do once you have a draft that you think is done and you can check, or is it something you can use for planning? Is that what you're referring to by how we're kind of flipping around how it's being used?
yeah, yeah. So in order to use it for planning, I think the portion that we would use for planning is something that Sean originally called the fool's cap, where you at a very macro level, you answer questions like, what is the genre of my story? And he breaks it down even to internal and external genres. What's my narrative device? Who is telling the story and how are they telling the story? The controlling idea. So all of that stuff is part of planning, as well as coming up with the scenes that you need for each act or each quadrant. He uses four quadrants. And so you could certainly do that planning as well. And there's lots of tools that you can use to decide what scenes belong where. However, it really gets fun. You can apply it to, if you've written a scene and you wonder if a scene works, you can apply the five commandments to a scene or use the five commandments to outline a scene. So it works even at that micro level. So it
Can
could
you
be
share the
indoor.
five commandments for us?
Yeah,
I mean, this is all
absolutely. Yeah.
super. I
Yeah.
I love to geek out about story and different ways to look at it. So we'll do that in just a moment. And I'm also curious, what is special about StoryGrid versus author methodologies of constructing or evaluating a story? Like what do you see as an editor in this space that works better?
For me in particular, I think what works better is it's very tangible. I feel like he has put words and concepts to things that we've only been able to feel. Like if somebody gives you your manuscript back and is like, this dialogue feels flat, well, what does that really mean? And Sean has been able to give us words to talk about what that means. We talk about misattuned dialogue and valenced language, and really can get in and take that flat part and talk about why and what needs to happen. That in addition to the idea of the five commandments, because the other really cool thing about StoryGrid is his idea of the five commandments, because they really apply to every unit of story. So no matter where you are in your writing or your manuscript, you can apply them to see if that particular portion is working.
And by
So
unit of story, you mean a scene, a chapter,
yeah,
a
yeah.
act.
Yep.
Okay.
So your whole story, obviously, and then he breaks it down into four quadrants. A lot of methods use three acts. And then from there you get into the scene, and that's really where the magic happens. If you can learn to really write a good scene. But there's units of story even smaller than that. There's tropes that he talks about, there's beats that he talks about as units of energy on the page. It can get really heady. So let's get back to the five commandments because they show up in all of those. There's global five commandments, quadrant five commandments, scene level five commandments. So the five commandments are, if you guys are all ready for them.
Totally ready. You've been building this up.
I know.
Actually, I'm ready to talk about these. Let's do it.
Okay. So, and a lot of them will probably sound familiar because I think there's a lot of crossover in methodology. So, of course, we start with your inciting incident. So that's a ball of chaos that comes into the story and knocks your protagonist's life off balance. It could be something small or big, but it's indicating that something's not right in the world for the protagonist and they need to respond to it. And then, of course, we all know that in an exciting story, that'll progressively complicate as you're reading. That's what keeps your readers hooked. But it gets to a point where you get to your second commandment, which is the turning point. So that's the progressive complication that pushes the protagonist past how they usually respond, and they realize, shoot, this is new territory. I really either need to transform or I need to double down. And so it becomes this binary crisis. And Sean teaches that third commandment crisis as a binary question. Do I do this or do I do this? And there should be a lot of stakes to both of them. And it's usually a best bad choice
I love that. The
where
best bad
yeah,
choice. That's so great.
like neither choice is it's not gonna be obvious which choice you're gonna want to take because there's different stakes applied to it. So there's the best bad choice or the irreconcilable goods choice, which is it's good for me but not for you, or vice versa. So it's a real crisis of what do I choose because I'm balancing what's at stake. So he teaches crisis as a binary question. So it's a real choice with incompatible options.
And binary just meaning there's two
Just there's
choices.
only two
Could be yes or
choices.
no, could be
Yeah.
black or white, could be
It's
whatever.
this or that, but it's not going to be an obvious choice. There has to be meaningful stakes attached to both of them. And it's going to tell us a lot about your protagonist's character and context, in terms of what they choose. So the choice is the climax. So that's the fourth commandment. The climax is what the protagonist decides to do as a result.
So the number 3, the binary question, is posing the question,
Yep.
and then the character's grappling with it, and then they make a choice,
And
it kind of gets resolved in the climax.
Well, so the climax is the actual choice.
Yeah.
And then the fifth commandment's the resolution, which is what happens as a result of that choice, is usually the rest of the scene.
Do you ever use the word denouement? Because I think it's something it's kind of
French.
Yeah, well, it is, but it doesn't mean anything in French. It's a literary term that means the same in French and English, but it's kind of that ending or resolution, and it used to be taught that way, and it's no longer on. And I'm trying to bring it back, and it's sort of that denouement, and it's kind of that there is a resolution, but it's that status quo and showing, yes, the resolution, but what is the new norm, or what is that new? It's not just the end and then we're done. Right?
Yeah, I love that you said, and I love that you said status quo, because that really is part of it. Because before the inciting incident, you're in the status quo.
Right.
And then the inciting incident happens. And then, by the time you get to the resolution, you're in a new status quo. So as you roll into the next scene, you're in your new status quo. You're going to have another inciting incident come in to play for a new scene. So as a story grid editor, if I am evaluating a manuscript, I'm really looking for those 5 things at the scene level. And so I might delineate a scene differently than the author may have felt or intended, but I can actually say exactly why this is a scene. You can break up chapters differently. Chapters are not scenes.
No, chapters, and I like to say that chapters are relatively arbitrary in the grand scheme. I mean, the only chapter break that I advise to pay attention to is the end of chapter 3, because psychologically, a reader, an agent, a publisher, we're kind of trained to go 3 chapters in and say, am I going to keep going? And there's this commitment. So the first couple of, we're kind of willing to get our feet wet, and we're willing to wait a little bit. And there's a contract in the first chapter with your reader that says this is what the book is going to be about. But if you're not sort of at that precipice that your character is on the adventure by the end of chapter 3. So other than that, move them around, make them long, make them short, do whatever you want with chapters, and pay attention to scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's where Story Grid puts a lot of their energy, is the scene level.
That is so awesome. Okay, so I mean, I teach these things in slightly different ways, and like you said, there's some overlap with lots of different methods. The Story Grid one is so detailed to me, and I love that. But many writers, it can be, you already said, a little overwhelming. So any tips to keep from getting overwhelmed?
Honestly, I feel like the biggest tip is try not to think about it, honestly, because you can unless your brain really likes that structure. Like I think StoryGrid really was designed as an analysis tool first and foremost. So write your scenes. And then if you've learned StoryGrid, you can look at it through that filter, or you can give it to somebody who has, and see what's working and what's not, and then make adjustments accordingly. But if you overthink it going in, I think you can really paralyze yourself.
Yeah, and I think some of these things, like you said, you may have already done in your scenes, or you may do
Exactly.
naturally for some
Yep.
of the scenes that are clearer, and some of them might be murky,
Yep.
right? And it
Exactly.
can help you
Yeah.
clarify after the fact
Yep.
rather
Exactly.
than trying to plan with it.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's, yeah, that's the first tip. Don't overthink it. But if you want to use it to plan, it can be a very handy planning tool if you understand the five commandments, and you, because then it acts as, okay, I know this is going to be status quo and the inciting incident, and you can kind of map out where you want to go, and then you should just fill in all the
Yeah.
detail in
But if you
between.
find it overwhelming,
Yeah, if you find that
maybe
overwhelming, just don't
do
do
it
it
after.
and do it after.
Do it after and then
Yeah,
just fill in the gaps. I love that. I
yeah.
love that. Okay. So one of the reasons, so Joanne and I actually are in the same place, even though she's from Alaska and I live in
Wow.
Canada, and we are currently in the States and at a conference together, which is amazing. We've been having amazing conversations about so many things. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to have her on the show was because the show is Show Don't Tell. And yes, we do talk about the craft of Show Don't Tell, but I know that StoryGrid teaches Show Don't Tell in a slightly different way. And I want to bring this to our writers and listeners here is let's talk about Show Don't Tell. Like that it's not just tired writing advice, right? Like what does
Right,
it mean in
right.
the StoryGrid universe?
Yeah, it's a little bit different in the StoryGrid universe. I mean, we certainly look for writing that is showing and not telling how we all have been taught growing up. Don't write boring things, essentially.
Right, boring things.
But what does that mean, right?
Yeah.
So StoryGrid kind of does it on two levels. So the show don't tell is connected to the StoryGrid's narrative device. And this is part of something that you could use in your planning or outlining ahead of time, is encouraging you to think about who is telling your story. Like, yes, you as the writer are telling your story, but at a different level, you can simulate who is telling this story and to whom. And so they've differentiated that as, in the real world, there's the artist and there's the reader, right? There's Suzy as the author, or sorry, I'm not going to use the term author. Suzy is the artist, she's the writer, and she's writing a book that us people out here in the real world are going to read.
And I love that you're going to go beyond that. I was just at a
Yes.
school visit
Yeah.
a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about voice, and I had written, and this was something specific to this class where the teacher really had asked me to do this, and so I was like, "Oh, I can do that." And so I went home and I actually wrote, it took me a couple of hours and it was ridiculous, but I wrote a story four ways where I gave them what the plot was, and they wrote it four different ways, and it was in four different voices. And so it was a story of pirate treasure, and I wrote it from the perspective of the pirate, and then I wrote it from the perspective of a queen, and then I wrote it from the perspective of, and the same things happened, but a different person.
Exactly.
And then
Yes.
there was a kid who got a treasure map at school, and then there was a parrot, which was their
Yes.
favorite. And I
Oh, for
kept
sure.
saying, who do you I read them the story with all the voices and things. It was hilarious. And they loved the stories. They were enraptured. And then I said, okay, who do you think wrote this story? And they say, you did, Suzy.
This is a perfect example. I love this. Yes.
Right? You did,
Yes.
Suzy. And I'm like, well, no, but like, who's the character? They're like, it's you. You wrote it. And I'm like, okay.
No, but who's telling
Let's
the
go deep.
story?
Yeah. So
Yeah,
so
so
who's
you're
telling
going
the story?
deeper.
I know you
Yes.
are gonna be, yeah, you're gonna
Well,
be able to get it.
that's exactly right, because you're going to be using different words, different language, if it's a parrot telling the story versus a pirate telling the
Yeah, that was really
story.
fun to read out loud.
Oh,
There's
I
lots of
bet.
squawks and
Walking.
repetitive, and then
Yeah. Oh my God.
let's actually take the treasure. He decides everybody else got cursed, and the parrot like decides that treasure is of gold is of no use to
Oh,
me, and he flew off, and then he was never cursed, and that boat was never heard from
I
again.
love that. I love that. Yeah, so StoryGrid often uses the example of The Hobbit to illustrate this concept of artist and reader versus author, and we call it single audience member, SAM for short. So with The Hobbit, your artist is J.R.R. Tolkien, and the readers are us out here in the world. It's the mass audience. But the author in the Sam of The Hobbit is actually a grandfather telling a bedtime story to his grandchildren. And you can see that in the language sometimes. I think there's one point where he addresses his audience member to make sure that they know, like, oh, it doesn't get too scary. At one point he like breaks that fourth wall. But you can simulate that for your own stories. And as an outlining tool, making that choice ahead of time can be really helpful to simulate who is telling this story and to whom. And so picturing even just your author and your Sam sitting at a coffee shop
Not your
talking to
Samwise Gamgee, though.
no, Sam, your signal audience member. Yes, hello to all you Sams out there. You'll be hearing that a lot as I talk about this. Yeah. So picture your single audience member as somebody who has a similar problem to your protagonist. And then think about your author as who in that person's life has the knowledge and ability to tell a story that's going to help Sam with her problem. So it's very much a mental simulation, but it can really help you hone in on what language to use, how to tell the story, what POV to choose, first person, third person, how omniscient you want to be, and make all those decisions in a really intentional way.
Yeah, and I love that. I mean, the point of view, especially when I work with newer writers, choosing a point of view, everybody does. And I think one of the things that we don't always do well,
Right.
and we go back to our 12th grade English class notes or something. We say, okay, well, there's first person, second person, which is like you, which is great. Actually, in business books, I use it a lot when I coach business books, but it's not often used in fiction. Third person is probably one of the most common. And then there's this like omniscient, and third person can be close or far or distant. And then there's omniscient. And I often find that writers, especially when they're newer to the craft, they will just pick one, and whichever one they feel is easiest, or whichever one is the easiest way that they see to write a story. And so I get a lot of omniscient writers that come in, and it's very, I'll tell you right now, it may seem like the easiest, it's actually the most difficult one to do well.
Yeah.
And it's also very uncommon in most commercial fiction today.
Yeah.
In most fiction that actually gets published. So if you choose omniscient, you must do it perfectly. So if it's your first book, look really seriously at one of these other options is my recommendation, because it's really hard to do it well. And if you don't do it well, then it doesn't work. Anyways, that was an
Yeah,
aside.
no, absolutely. And I think too, if you're feeling like you're having problems with POV and something's not feeling like it's working, think about your narrative device. Who's telling this story? Would they be telling it in an omniscient way? Or do you need to choose
Could they access? Yeah, could they
yeah,
access everybody's thoughts
yeah,
like a true God or omniscient
right,
person
right.
would? Yeah.
Yeah. So that is one way to analyze your story is have I chosen the right POV? And that all trickles back down to that narrative device. Who's the author? And who are they telling the story to help solve her problem? And so where this is connected to show don't tell. So again, picture these two people at a coffee shop. And as your author is telling the story to their friend, showing the way I like to think about it is showing is kind of like where Sam is looking at the table and is looking at the action. The author is showing them what is happening. And then in moments where the author is telling Sam something, Sam looks up and is looking directly at the author to get the information that she needs. So often telling happens in exposition. It has more.
Can you explain exposition just for our listeners?
Yeah, exposition being, not the dialogue bits. A lot of the description, a lot of the camera shifting if you're trying to get from one place to another, world building, information Sam needs or your reader needs to make sense of what's happening.
I love that. I've never heard it told like that before, where we look at the narrator's face and watch them tell
Yeah.
the story
Yeah.
versus showing it. I mean, there's lots of things that I teach that are similar. For
Yeah.
example, we don't want to hear somebody telling you what happened. We want to
Yeah.
be there. It's like, oh gosh,
Yeah.
Joanne, this thing happened downstairs and somebody slipped and fell and it was hilarious. And
Yeah.
they're like, what are you talking about? And say, oh, you had to be there, right?
Yeah.
Like, so it's bringing Joanne to that moment and showing her
Mhm.
the way that it happened and letting her experience it
Yeah.
versus having something happen off screen,
Yep.
right? Or
Yeah.
like in a movie, it would be
Yeah.
something happened off screen. So
Yeah.
bring that person to the moment and show them. But I just love that.
Yeah.
That's such a boring. I think that's really going to resonate with the listeners. It'd be really boring to have a movie, for example, with, I'll say, my face. Nobody wants to watch my face telling you a story, right? Like
Yeah.
for 2 hours. That's not cool. That's boring. And that's what your sort of reader can conjure. And show don't tell has so many facets, and we're going to go through a few more here. But really, the concept is, can the reader create an image in their mind, and can they feel it and can they experience it versus feeling really separate from it or
Yeah.
feeling like they missed out on the banana peel moment.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I feel like it's important to say there are times where telling is perfectly fine, but you
Absolutely.
still need to this is going to get really maybe confusing, but you still need to use showing language in your telling. If the author is telling Sam something, you can still use, and in StoryGrid we call that valence language. Be very particular about the words that you're using, so they're rich, they're descriptive,
They're
they're
specific.
specific.
Yeah.
So you're really getting across the meaning of what's happening. So even if the author is needing to take a moment to tell something, because it's more subjective, and it might be a moment that the artist really wants to make sure that meaning gets through versus letting the reader create the meaning for themselves. There's moments where, you might want to make that artistic decision.
Yeah.
But that's how I think about it. If it's really good showing writing, it feels like I'm watching something play out in front of me versus looking up at who's telling me the story.
Right. And if you're thinking about, back to the movie analogy, your camera is your choice, right? You're zooming in on the
Yeah.
bridge and you're hearing what's happening on the bridge and you can hear their dialogue. That's showing.
Yeah.
If you're zooming back and you are doing a montage, right, across the
Yeah.
screen, or you see Joanne's face coming up and telling you the
Yeah.
story,
Yeah.
that's telling. And there are moments for both of those in writing. I tend to be really encouraging on the show don't tell front because most writers in the beginning don't do enough showing.
Yeah.
It's easier to tell, especially in a first draft. You're telling yourself that first draft for the first time. It's harder to dive into those moments and pick and choose when you do it. And then I love that moment when a writer's pages come in and I'm like, you're showing too much. And
Yeah.
they're like, what? Like
You told me
they've
to.
zoomed in on something
Yes.
and they've drained the well dry and showed me a whole conversation that has nothing to do with anything and it's kind of boring, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, summarize that. She told her about the banana peel moment, right?
Yeah.
Like let's keep using that. And
Yeah.
then sometimes those things can be told. But in all likelihood, when you're starting at least, you probably are telling too much.
Yes, yes, that's what we're seeing. And in fact, in so I work as a mentor in the StoryGrid writer mentorship program, and that's really what they're teaching right now and practicing is just writing action, writing that we call it on the surface, things you can see, hear, touch, smell, taste. If you're writing at that action level in a way that's valenced, your reader's going to get the meaning out of
Yeah.
what you're
And
trying
I
to
like to tell writers too, and tell me what you think of this.
do.
Okay, so yes, the five senses, absolutely, but some of them are more important than others. And usually we rely on vision or see.
Hmm.
And so be aware that you're not only doing that, but taste is the one that I like to joke that you get maybe twice in a book, unless it's a book about food somehow and it's truly important. We don't want to walk into the room and describe all the things and how does it sound and how does it look and what does it smell like and then bend down and lick the floor and let everybody know what it tastes like, right? Like it's quite funny. I actually was working, well, not funny, but I was working with a writer recently. Hopefully you're listening. And I was making that crack about taste and they shared with me that they'd been given the advice to use it at least twice in every scene. And I said, no, 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 no. So what do you think about that?
Oh, that's interesting.
Taste twice in every scene?
No, I would say make sure you have at least two of the senses in every
Yeah,
scene.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
but
But
not,
taste is one
yeah,
that just isn't, it just isn't as
it
important.
needs to be very context appropriate.
Yeah. Very
Yeah, we're
context
not going around
appropriate.
like licking floors,
Don't
just
go around,
because.
have your character licking the floor unless that's really important
Or,
somehow, or they live in Candyland or
yeah,
something.
yeah.
All right, Joanne, how long does this process take to evaluate it using the story grid method? Is it like as an editor?
Yeah. It can take a really long time if you're using the spreadsheet and you're filling in all the pieces, certainly. However, if you're wanting to just analyze a scene, it shouldn't take very long to see if you have the five commandments there. So we generally try to practice like a 1,000 word scene. If you're able to read that and get a sense for, okay, here's the inciting incident, turning point, crisis, climax, resolution, should take half an hour to 45
For
minutes
a scene,
for a
yeah. But
scene.
typically when people submit something and then it becomes analyzed by an editor,
Yeah.
is it weeks? Is it months?
Oh,
Does it take
yeah.
you, does it take a year to revise? Like, what's this going to
Yeah.
add to the process? I mean, I can see the value.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say if it's a dedicated project, most story grid editors, I think, take a month to do
Yeah.
a story grid analysis. And that's generally at least the 20 core scenes. So the five commandment scenes in each quadrant. So each, and that's what I was talking about, every unit of story. We're going to identify what the global five commandments are.
Yeah.
Those scenes that are acting as those global five commandments, and at the quadrant level is very important as well. And then at the scene level, it is probably a little bit editor dependent in terms of how fast you analyze each scene, but we're really looking for the five commandments and that value shift. What has actually changed in the story? And if you do your five commandments well, you should have a clear shift from the beginning to the end. Something has changed because that's the whole point of the
Yes,
story, right?
absolutely. That's
Yeah.
the arc, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's some fun ones for you.
Okay.
Deep breath. Now, what's the coolest thing that's happened to a writer that you've worked with using StoryGrid? Like, what's the coolest thing that you've seen happen to a writer's book? Like, is there an example that you can give us where you're like, yes, that was what that story needed?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple anecdotes in terms of, I think the light bulb moments of being able to recognize a lot of what they're already doing right and being able to just describe it in a way that's more understandable, or that is, you're not just giving feedback like, "Ooh, great scene." It's like, "Ooh, great scene because this, and this, like and this is why this is solid."
Yeah.
And those light bulb moments of, I mean, most writers they have an intuition about it and they just don't have necessarily the words to apply to it. So I love the light bulb moments where they recognize what they're already doing well and then understanding the parts in a new way that they can then apply and get better. So I have seen a lot of that, especially in the writer mentorship program. In terms of manuscript level, I had an author come to me with an almost done manuscript, but she didn't know what to do with the ending. She was stuck at the end. And we worked through those core questions about genre and about, identifying each scene in the quadrant and how they were acting at that five commandment level, and asking questions about why was she telling the story in the first place? What was the controlling idea? And was she heading in that direction? And we were able to answer a lot of those questions, find out what she was missing. She went away for a few months and then came back. And I mean, her manuscript was night and day. She was able
Yeah, I believe it.
to really rewrite it in a way that she knew what she was doing with it at that point.
Yeah. I mean, the
Yeah.
writer's goals are really important.
Yes, first and
Stay
foremost.
true
Yeah.
to your why. Why are you writing this
Yeah.
particular story at this particular moment? And sometimes we miss that. Even, I love that that's part of the story grid methodology, because the big picture of it, yeah, we can go and analyze all the things, but if you haven't accomplished what you meant to accomplish with that book, none of that matters.
Yeah, I think that's why she was stuck with the ending, is because maybe she had veered off course and
Yeah.
really needed to get clear on why she was writing it and what she wanted the message to be. And so once we cleared that up, she was able to
Yeah,
get it
amazing.
finished.
Love
Yeah.
that. Okay. So, Joanne, if you could leave these listeners with one piece of advice, what's your best piece of your go-to advice for a new writer who's just joining this industry and trying to make a go of it? And what would you tell yourself when you were starting?
Gosh, what's coming up for me right now is to just write, to really be brave, get words on the page. Don't get paralyzed by trying to follow a certain type of structure or method. Use those as tools in your toolbox. Get words on the page, get clear about why you're writing, what you want to say, and then apply those tools. Then go find the tools that you need to fix the things that you need to fix instead of trying to shoehorn your story into a particular way of doing things.
Yeah, love it. Love it. Okay, Joanne, this has been awesome. Do you want to talk a little bit about what it is that you offer for writers, both your coaching, your editing, and where can we find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me at Shelf Life Editorial. That's a bit of a mouthful. So
I'll drop it
yeah,
in the show links.
JoanneHaines.com takes you to the same place. I primarily I primarily work with authors one-on-one. So I offer monthly coaching, and always at the beginning of that, it's evaluating what they already have through many of these story grid lenses. A lot of people come through the story grid pipeline to me, but even if you've never heard of story grid, there's ways to talk about it and apply it without overwhelming you with the jargon. Yeah, and really the relationship with the author is the most important thing to me. So I get very clear on your intentions, what you're wanting to do with the story, your why for writing, and then supporting you in reaching your goals.
Ah, I love that. That
Yeah.
must be why we're friends because yeah, that's exactly
Yeah.
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Is, what does the author want? And at
Yeah.
the end of the day, it's not really just about what's correct or what these are all tools, these are all
Yeah.
methodologies, and they are all just one more thing that you can evaluate your story
Yeah.
by.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Joanne.
Thank
This has
you,
been
Suzy. It
awesome.
has been a blast. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to Show Don't Tell Writing with me, Suzy Vidori. Help me continue to bring you the straight goods for that book you're writing or planning to write. Please consider subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you're listening. Also visit suzyvidori.com/newsletter to hop on my weekly inspired writing newsletter list, where you'll stay inspired and be the first to know about upcoming training, events, and writing courses that happen in my community. If you're feeling brave, check the show notes and send us a page of your writing that isn't quite where you want it to be yet for our Show Don't Tell page review episodes. Remember, that book and your writing is going to open doors that you haven't even thought of yet, and I can't wait to help you make it the absolute best. If you're feeling called to write that book, keep going, and I'm going to be right here cheering you on. See you again next week.